Welcome to the Unstuck and Happy podcast. We all get stuck, but how long you stay there is up to you. I'm your host, John Polish, founder of the Unstuck Happiness Conference. And this is the show where we interview people who've overcome tremendous adversity and have emerged as leaders. So if you need a little inspiration and hope in your day, get ready, because here comes another great Unstuck story. Well, our guest today definitely has an unstuck story. Linda Shively is a neuroscience and mindset expert and award-winning speaker and has presented across the country at places like New York City Bar Association, the Harvard Club of Boston, Walmart, and Carnegie Hall. Linda has been a multiple-time guest and host on cable television, featured in a movie with Winona Ryder and Jeff Daniels, and performed at the Rose Bowl for over 90,000 people. Award-winning physicians, entrepreneurs, and realtors have sought her out to decrease the stress and overwhelm in their lives by eliminating their self-sabotaging patterns. I'm excited to introduce San Francisco Bay Area native, master practitioner of NLP, executive coach, and certified laughing yoga leader, Linda Shively. Welcome.
Thanks, John. It's so great to be here with you.
So I have to start by asking about the movie. What was that about?
It was fun. I had an opportunity to be in the movie Welcome Home, Roxy Carmichael, which most people haven't heard of, but it was back in the late 80s, and it was a lot of fun.
Very cool.
Standing around late at midnight performing.
And what were you performing at the Rose Bowl?
I was in the UCLA marching band. So UCLA's home field happens to be the Rose Bowl. So I performed there for home games year after year.
Nice. And so from the Rose Bowl and the marching band to now changing lives across the country.
Yes.
Pretty cool, huh? So what is it that you speak about?
Well, to give you a little bit of background, back in 2005, I had to make a really tough decision. I had to figure out how to get out of an abusive marriage with my severely handicapped 3-year-old daughter, Jessica. And she had a neuromuscular disorder called spinal muscular atrophy, which at the time had no treatment and no cure. And she has so much joy and would express it through her eyes, even though she zipped around in a power chair at preschool and was able to survive well past the year mark that the neurologist said. Exactly 2 weeks after we escaped, I held her in my arms as she took her last breath and died.
So sorry.
And from that moment on, I struggled to see any kind of future for myself. And I had no idea what to do, how to make sense of all of it. And I realized that the one key that I had learned was how important it is to be in joy, because Jessica lived her life in joy. And it didn't matter what was going on around her. She was happy. And I realized that I could learn from that. And I had a friend who had told me, it doesn't matter what happens to you. It's what you do with that matters. And I took that to heart and started taking care of myself, getting the counseling, getting the coaching, doing the self-development work so that I could feel better. And then I could start helping other people. So now I talk about how to tame your joy-stealing dragons in life and in business. And that's a long answer to your short question.
That's okay. We have time, so we. So I remember when I first, my first involvement in National Speaker Association on a national level. I've been doing the Unstuck Happiness conferences, and somebody told me right away, you have to meet Linda, you have to hear her story. And to this day, I think I've met you 3 different times now. And every time I'm about to hear your story, I get bombarded with a bunch of other people that join us. And I've never actually been able to hear it beginning to end until today. How long were you in that moment before you started seeking the self-development and the things that got you unstuck?
Well, the irony was I was in counseling about my marriage at the time. So I was trying to work on that at the time that my daughter died. So I was already getting that support right away, which helped. But as far as the personal growth work, it was probably about 8 years later that I really did a deep dive and really felt a major shift. I mean, there were shifts along the way, don't get me wrong, but the major shift probably happened around 10 years when I started my own business and really was doing this work full time.
So I can definitely relate. Monday would be my daughter's 11th birthday. I had her for 2 days, and I spent 5 years in that, what I call a 5-year period of darkness, before I decided it was time to pick my life up and put it back together. And I did so by what I thought was just getting some thoughts out on paper, which ended up turning into a book and then a radio show and the whole speaking business and everything after that. What was your life like briefly during that 8-year period that you had?
Well, aside from everything kind of being up in the air, losing not only my daughter, my marriage, my home, my reason for being, all in an instant, I went back to the job that I worked at before she was born. And that felt safe because I was able to be with people, at least some people that I had known. Yet there was a significant learning curve because I worked in the IT industry and healthcare. And there was a huge learning curve because things had changed in the 4.5, 5 years that I hadn't been there. And then I knew that I wanted to speak. I knew that I wanted to share her story. I knew that that was important. And I started finding ways to do that. And I sought out Toastmasters initially and I still am in Toastmasters. I love Toastmasters. And it's a great way for people who are afraid to speak, and for those who want us to share a story, to develop it and get better at speaking. Plus, it's a community of people who really love it. And that was kind of my first step into personal development. And then the universe has a way of putting the right people in your life at the right time. And it was a series of events of meeting different coaches, meeting different support people, and developing into realizing that maybe this really could be my business, and learning neurolinguistic programming, which is a phenomenal tool to get your conscious mind and your unconscious mind on the same page and get rid of patterns that don't serve us. And so that's kind of a little bit of my journey. There's a lot of ups and downs in the midst of it. I mean, but that's it in a nutshell.
So part of the message I think that is being conveyed is that what I notice is you mentioned the right people come into your life when you need them. But I think that happens for all of us, but not everybody recognizes that or acknowledges it or does anything with it. I had almost the opposite experience where you said you wanted to speak right away. I remember getting home after losing my daughter, and my now ex-wife saying, she's like, someday I'm going to write books and speak about this. And I looked right at her and said, you go right ahead. I want no part of that. And now I'm writing books and speaking about it. But I didn't want that. I wasn't something I thought I would ever deal with. and the right people came into my life too, but they came in a totally different way. And it was actually a friend who was working for a multi-level marketing company. And she wanted me to introduce her to some people that I knew. And so I introduced her to this guy who was a nightclub promoter. He was a 21-year-old guy who was just kind of down and out and miserable. And he was talking about how he's raising his siblings and his parents were drug addicts and all these things. And then he's like, I need a new job. I need to make more money. And she stopped him. She goes, no, you just need to get on my vitamins. And I'm thinking, this guy needs help. He doesn't need vitamins. And I had a system, a way that I created 20 some years ago where I can literally put anyone's life on a graph in a couple minutes and help you pinpoint the areas of concern. And I hadn't done anything with it in years. And I did it in that moment. I'm like, let me look at this. And before you know it, everybody's like, oh, you should write a book. And I'm like, I don't read books. Why would I write one? But had just gone through a divorce, was alone. I was a teacher at the time, so I was home at 2 p.m. with nothing to do. I started going to a coffee shop and just writing. And that was my own therapy. But now I look back and I see those people were in my life for a reason, and as much as I didn't necessarily agree with the whole network marketing angle, I'm like, that was the person that was meant to be in my life to introduce me to this other person to get me moving again.
Exactly.
And so, any advice to people who really just keep missing that?
Start paying attention. People are in your life for a reason. Now, it may be to inspire you to follow what they're doing. It may be to recognize a pattern that you have that you do not want to keep, because not everybody is a positive influence in our lives, yet we can still learn from whatever situation we're in, because you have a choice. You have a choice to either be at effect of what's happening, because there are circumstances that we cannot control. Yet what you do have control over is how you deal with it, what you choose to do about it, what responsibility you have in the situation. Because any situation, even if it's not your fault, it is your responsibility, and how you deal with it. The circumstances around situations in life. I mean, if suddenly there's an earthquake, you didn't cause the earthquake, but how you react to it is your choice. You could say, oh, well, I can't do anything because the earthquake happened and blah, blah, blah. Or, okay, the earthquake happened. I need to take these steps to move forward and continue on with my life.
Or some crazy pandemic that might keep you at home for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I'm finding this period of time right now during this COVID-19 to be fascinating to people watch and study how people are behaving and what they're doing, what they're not doing, and understanding all the different aspects of it. Because yes, there's a lot of fear. Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I'm also seeing people that are thriving and being creative and being flexible, because, okay, now everything has changed. How do you make it work? So, and there's no right answer to it. It's what's working for you. And if something you're doing isn't working, try something different.
It's interesting because things change for all of us constantly, but never has it been for everybody all at once. Like, exactly. We all go through trials and, tragedies, but suddenly the whole world went through it at one time. It's very interesting to see. I think sometimes, what ends up happening is we spend a lot of time with ourselves and we have to reflect and deal with things we haven't dealt with in years. And that's why I think stories like yours are powerful, especially during this time. People need to see that there is hope.
Yeah. And that is definitely something that I've noticed is people will sometimes come up to me and say, well, you're just special that you were able to do this. It's like, no, I took a tragedy, but was able to turn it to use it as a resource, to use it as a positive. And I believe anyone has the capability of doing that. They just have to want to be able to do that. And it may, now this goes along with how much time does something take. You've heard the adage, time heals all wounds.
No.
You've never heard that? Okay.
I've heard it. I don't believe it.
I respectfully disagree.
Okay.
Because it doesn't. If you don't do anything with your time, nothing's going to change. Yeah. It's how you react, what you do for people that seek help, for people that actually make a change in their lives. That is something, then time might help you along, but just waiting for something to happen or change isn't going to happen.
You know, it's interesting because I teach a lot about emotional intelligence and that process. And one of the things I teach about is experience filters. We tend to think of emotions as fleeting. They come and they go, but actually we hold on to them. And every experience we have gets wrapped up in emotions, and we store them. We use them later as experience filters. And I wrote an article about this right before, it was actually a couple months before the Disney movie Inside Out came on. And I love the movie because it is actually a perfect depiction of what I'd already been teaching. Like, we hold on to all of those memories. And what happens is that the moment something happens that reminds us of a previous situation, those old emotions come back.
Right.
So
and we filter everything through what we've experienced in the past.
Yeah. So saying that time heals, well, it really doesn't, because if that was the case, we would never have those emotions come up, you know, and that's basically the abridged version of what PTSD is. It's that great tragedy, the trauma that happened, and all of a sudden a smell or a sound will bring you right back to that moment and bring that emotion back. And so, yeah, you're right. I don't think time itself does not heal wounds. You have to actually go through and do the work and replace that. And there's actually some of those wounds that never get healed. And I've had a lot of people tell me, you know, the strategy I used for most of my life was put it behind me and move on. And I have had people tell me flat out, they're like, I don't know how you can talk, and you've probably gotten this too. I don't know how you can go around and talk about sad things.
Yeah. Well, I don't know anybody who hasn't experienced something sad. Now, thankfully, not everybody I'm in contact with has experienced what I've experienced or what you've experienced, but everybody has something that's sad. And I think it's a gift to be able to talk about it. And I have found, by example, I talk about Jessica all the time. And I live in a community where only a couple people ever had the opportunity to meet her. And I know hundreds, thousands of people now who never had the opportunity to meet her in person, but they all know her because I talk about her and they feel like they know her. And I share photos of her. I share little videos that I have from when she was zooming around in her power chair. And it's a gift that they give to me to listen to my stories because I get to share her. And they feel it's a gift that I'm sharing her with them. So I've noticed they start sharing more stories about their loved ones that are no longer living, or they start sharing about an experience that maybe wasn't very good. And that common experience of sharing that vulnerability is powerful. And I think that goes to there's a fear of sharing that because people don't want to be vulnerable. People are afraid of what's going to happen if they actually reveal that deeper part of themselves. And in my experience, it's a great gift.
There's so many things in what you just said to unpack. I don't know, probably because I'm a guy, we're not supposed to have emotions or show emotions. So I shouldn't talk about those things in, my events, Unstuck Happiness Conference. I'll get, sometimes 8 to 10 people together who've had similar types of tragedies, not similar, but completely different tragedies, but similar in scale. And then everyone shares kind of what happened to them, what they did to get over it, and how they're inspiring other people now. And I've had people like, why would I want to go to that event? It just sounds horrible. It sounds sad. Why would, and I've never had a single person leave one of my events feeling sad. You know,
Exactly.
you feel inspired to know that if these people can pick up and move on, so can I. Like how, you know, when you hear some of the most tragic stories, you know, it gives you that hope and belief that if they can do it, I can get through whatever I'm going through. And what I've noticed is quite often some of the people in the audience have better stories than we have. I had one guy call me after he'd been to like 3 of my events, and I didn't know him at all, but he reached out to me. He's like, can I meet with you? And sure. He's like, you want to know why I come to your events? And I'm like, sure, I'd love to. Tell me. So he goes on to tell me a story about how his son was in an accident on the way to school one day and was killed in a car wreck. And then years later, his wife was still so upset about it that she sent him to the store. And while he was at the store, she took her own life. He's like, right afterwards, I found your event and I've been coming ever since because it's really inspiring me and helping me move on. And like, wow, like to think that just standing there and sharing a story could be helping somebody else process some of the most difficult parts of their lives. And that's the best part of it. It's not the applause. It's hearing the other people open up and start to share.
Yeah, I agree. And what you said is some people's are, I forget the word you used, worse or harder stories. There's no comparison. Everyone's story is hard. And I know people who've lost multiple children. I know people who've had their entire families killed in an accident. I can't compare my experience with their experience because we're different. And mine is the worst that I've experienced. Yours is the worst that you've experienced. Each person, and you know, I used to get really upset when somebody would come up to me and say, "Oh, I know exactly how you feel. My dog died." And I'm like, no. and then I try to be as compassionate as I can and be grateful that they have no idea what it's like to go through what I went through, and that they're doing their best based on their experience to find something similar. And it's taken a lot to get to that point, but it's the realization that people have hard experiences, and what they think is hard or what somebody else thinks is hard may be different, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not challenging for that individual.
Absolutely. I had my daughter for 2 days before she passed away. And afterwards, first of all, I heard about everybody's miscarriage they've ever had because they thought it was the same thing. And in my mind, at first I was upset hearing it. But then I realized exactly what you said. It's tragic to them. But one of the hard things for me afterwards was, you know, you're not constantly walking around in this state of misery, although people would think so. And so even to this day, when people start out, some of the questions that I get from people, and I know that I have to go there and I know I have to explain, and then knowing that their reaction is going to be, and then so for example, meeting people, one of the first questions is, oh, do you have kids? Well, what's the answer to that question? If I say no, then I'm not acknowledging my daughter. If I say yes, then they assume that I've raised a kid. So I'll explain. And then right away, oh, I'm so sorry. And they are suddenly super sad and down. And now I feel obligated to be sad with them to make them feel better.
It's that curse of grief that we have to educate people how to be around us, and or gift of grief. I don't know how you want to look at it, but it's sometimes I'm very gracious in how I talk to people if I want to continue a conversation, and sometimes I'm not. sometimes I'll just let them be miserable because I don't really care. But I know that sounds harsh, but from a standpoint of when I get a question like that, it took many years of trial and error to come up with the response that I felt worked for me and generally worked for other people. And that's something that I advise the parents in my Compassionate Friends group of how to respond to that question, because it will come up.
Yeah.
You will get asked. And for people that have surviving children and people that may have lost all their children, it's how do you respond? I always say, yes, I have a daughter. How I respond after that depends on the context.
Right.
Frequently it's, yes, I have a daughter. She's no longer living. She brought so much joy to my life and I love to talk about her, which then opens the opportunity for conversation, as opposed to, yeah, she died, which generally doesn't go well. Right. Although I have said that sometimes, and but that doesn't really lead to more conversation. It's right. Kind of like the improvisational technique of yes and, how do you extend a branch to somebody to let them continue the conversation?
So you tell your daughter's story often?
I tell it every time I speak. I tell it to people that I meet. It's not necessarily the first thing I bring up in conversation, but it definitely is. If it's somebody that I'm going to talk to more than once, they're going to know this information about me.
So when you're speaking, this is a question probably only someone like you would understand. Is there anything that you do to put you in the moment to prepare you to speak about it? Let me clarify that a little bit. So
let me know I'm not sure what direction you're trying to get me to go.
So I'll just share my experience and put it in context, and then you can share. 2015 is when I first started even considering speaking, and I went through the NSA Academy program there, and we did this graduation speech at the end, and I was preparing for my speech, and I would always have, my daughter's story as part of it. And we would prepare in front of the board and we would practice, and they would coach us. And after sharing the story so many times, at this point, I'm just practicing getting the words out. Like, do I have all my words down? Do I know what I'm going to do? Do I know where I'm going to stand? Do I have my little NLP stuff down for the speech? Like all those things. And I had somebody turn to me and goes, "Did you care about your daughter?" And I went like, "What?" And they're like, "Well, you're telling this really powerful story, but you're just going through the motions." I'm like, "Yeah, because it's the 20th time I've done it today." But that set me, I took that serious. And so I never want to give a speech and talk about her where it's part of a speech, but it's part of the speech, So what I've ended up doing is I had a video montage of her that I made like 2 days after she passed. And it's, very powerful with the music and everything. And so anytime I'm going to speak about her, I will watch that video that day. That way, when I show the picture of her, it sends me back to that moment. So the emotions are fresh and real, and they never come across as stale. Like, oh yeah, I'm using that as part of a speech. And so I guess does that ever get to you? Do you ever have anything like that?
It's a very challenging line to meet, to get to that emotional place without going over it. And because I've talked about it so much, sometimes it does come across as less emotional, shall I say. Yet I try to get back into that moment as much as I can, because of the joy, because of the love that is always there. And now I am more happy about it than I am sad. And so and I can't tell you at what point in my life that shift happened. It's been more than 14 years since she died. It was December of 2005. And So I'm not sad talking about her. I am, yes, it is sad going back to the experience of her dying, but the talking about her isn't something that is sad for me, if that makes sense.
It doesn't.
But I hear what you're saying, and I like your idea of watching something, getting something back into that moment even more.
I think the reason that I think you pretty much mentioned why I do it is because you're right. I'm not sad about it anymore either. And, I've used it for good and started the conferences and seen how many people have been affected by it. So absolutely, I don't feel sad about it, but I know that it's a powerful story. And I know that I actually teach, and this was something that was taught to me, but about living in a speaking world, being in this emotional scale, and you're taking your audience is going on an emotional journey with you. And so I know that the moment that I'll get them, I know that I have to get them to laugh or have some high emotion early on. But then when I tell her story, I know it's going to hit people, whether it hits me or not. So if I tell the story about losing my daughter and I sound happy as I'm telling it, I especially me being a guy and, everything else, it can come off as insensitive and whatever. So I pause in that moment and I give the audience a chance to catch up and feel. But if I don't watch that video first, and there have been a couple of times where I didn't, and I got off the last Unstuck I did, afterwards I got off and I'm like, that was horrible. This was not a good speech. What was wrong? And I went through everything. I'm like, no, I did everything. What didn't I do right? Oh, I didn't watch the video that day. So it didn't get me in that moment the same way. The audience had the same reaction, but I knew something was a little bit off. And it's not really for me to stand there and be sad, but it's for me to realize that this is a very powerful moment that they need to absorb so that we can get to that happy place afterwards.
Right. Because regardless how many times we have shared the story, for somebody in our audience, or perhaps everybody in our audience, it may be the first time they're hearing it.
Yeah.
And to make sure that we honor their experience of that in the best way possible, and holding it in a way where it is a journey so that it's not leaving them in that low spot.
Exactly.
For ever.
Yeah. I call it the grocery checker syndrome. And so every once in a while at the grocery store, people are checking, how's your day? And they don't look up, and I'll make some comment like, yeah, my dog told me those were really good. And I'll wait for a second until yeah, okay. And they're like, wait, your dog talks, just catch them off guard in the moment,
Yeah. So. It's like, what is it that, wait, what?
Yeah, exactly.
Get that kind of reaction. Yeah.
So I think it's great that you're sharing. Who are you typically speaking to these days?
Well, right now it has shifted since everything is virtual. So right. I am trying to get into doing a lot more podcasts, talking to different groups that are wanting some uplifting message right now, which is quite a few. I've been leading laughter yoga online, which is a lot of fun because it's an instant stress relief. It's what I like to say, the first step in transformation, because if we can laugh about something, then we can have a possibility of changing it.
I used to lead laughter yoga live all the time.
Really?
Yeah.
Another thing we have in common.
It wasn't really called that. I would go to yoga and everyone there would laugh at me.
See, it's different.
But it works. Same result.
This is laughing with intention. And your body doesn't know the difference if you're laughing because of humor or comedy, or if you are just laughing. And the most powerful sessions I've led are with grief groups. And so getting a room full of parents whose children have died in a room who haven't laughed in years, and getting them to laugh is probably one of the best experiences I've had
Actually, that's a very trending thing right now. The retreat that I did for the shooting victims, they actually brought in a trauma recovery yoga group to do some, I guess, trauma yoga is what they called it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, when I was going through my training, I learned about grief yoga because it was something I hadn't understood, and in that moment I knew that I could use the laughter yoga to help people who were grieving, and I also use it for other people too because we all can laugh.
Yeah, apparently there's yoga for just about any situation out there, which I always find interesting.
Yeah. You can adapt to anything.
Yeah, apparently my ex did a video called Yoga for Constipation. And I'm like, look at that. We've both done Unstuck videos. There we go. I know. So where can we find you?
You can find me at lindashively.com. And you can also, if you want a little bit of stress relief, you can find me on Facebook. It's Stress Relief with Laughter and Gratitude. It's a group, so anyone can join that. And
go on. Yeah,
I was going to say, John, if any of your listeners are feeling like the story that they're telling themselves is not useful and they're ready to change it, and they're whatever that story might be, and they're at a point where it's like, I am tired of living this unhelpful story and I want to switch it. Go to my website and you can sign up for an Access Your New Story discovery session, and we'll have a conversation, talk about where you are, where you want to be, and what your next step plan is. And if it feels like a fit, we can talk about what working together would look like.
Awesome. I'm so glad I finally had a chance to hear your story. And what is one piece of advice you can leave us with?
One piece of advice. You have a choice. So anytime you feel stuck, do something, anything, take some action to move yourself forward.
Keep moving. I love it. Linda Shively, everybody, thank you, and catch us back again next week.
Thanks, John.
Thanks. Make sure you head over to unstuckandhappy.com, where you'll find the video version of all of our podcasts, as well as information about upcoming Unstuck Happiness conferences and moving beyond personal development retreats. Those are amazing. Make sure you join us again next week for another great Unstuck story. And in the meantime, keep living unstuck and happy.